Hello, everyone. My name is Deborah Yashar. I am the director of the Princeton Institute for International and Regional Studies, Pierce, and also a professor in the politics department and SPIA, the Public Policy School. And it's really great to see all of you today for today's Global Existential Challenges seminar. For those who've been watching this and looking online, this particular semester we focused on democracy around the globe. Especially given that 2024 is oftentimes understood as the year of elections that have happened, all around the world, and oftentimes with rising concerns going into those elections about polarization, populism, democratic backsliding, erosion, and the like, and oftentimes some hope for democratic resilience in that context. So this has been a year just pregnant with debates about democracy in many parts of the world. Last month, we had a terrific panel that was focused on elections, comparing Africa with Latin America, with South Asia. That was a really interesting panel with colleagues who were visiting as part of our advisory council. But obviously, this is a debate and a concern that doesn't just focus on places beyond, but also is very present in our own context. In the United States, obviously, we just had an important election where many of these concerns about polarization and the like were at the forefront before the election and remain on our minds today. So today's panel is really incredibly good timing to think about these sorts of questions. And I should say it grew out of an unexpected conversation that happened, I believe, in August when I ran into Sam Levin. And I was talking with him about his work this summer, and he mentioned that he was working with Sam Wang, particularly focused on many of these questions. And we thought that this would be a great opportunity to bring them to Pierce, which is a space for multidisciplinary conversations around these critical issues. And so today's panel really is the consequence of that conversation. And we're so delighted to have these two innovative scholars with a footnote that I'll come back to in a moment, whose interest in contemporary politics is profound and is actually informed by a very multidisciplinary training. So let me mention the two speakers, as I said, with a caveat at the end, and then our discussant. So first off, Simon Levin, whose name is here on the screen, is the James S. McDonnell Distinguished University Professor in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology here at Princeton. He's actually a mathematician by training, but for those of you who know him, you know that he has a very multidisciplinary orientation. He has collaborated with colleagues all across the campus and beyond. And his publication record, I'm not even going to try and summarize it. Since this year alone, he's co-authored 15 articles. Last year, some 22. He is a prolific scholar, but we're really bringing him to the table today because of his work broadly on polarization and cooperation, thinking about individual and collective behavior. Sam Wang is the professor of neuroscience here at Princeton. He is also extremely well known to all of you. His research and lab investigates how brains learn from sensory experience in adulthood and development with relevance, particularly for a wide range of topics, including autism. He has also been actively involved in analyzing and engaging U.S. politics as a scholar and a public intellectual, been involved in many different kinds of organizations, including Princeton Election Consortium and the Princeton Gerrymandering Project. Perhaps you've even heard him on the radio at different moments around election time as we've thought about gerrymandering in this context. So I want to start off by saying we are so fortunate to have both of these speakers on the table. However, unfortunately, Sam was not able to come today. I'm sorry, Simon. Sam is here. Simon was not able to come today. Unexpectedly, something has occurred, so he's not here personally, although he has shared his slides, obviously as a long-time collaborator with Sam, who is here for the presentation. So Sam is going to speak for some 45 minutes about the work that they're doing collaboratively. And then we are so fortunate to have Keena Lipsitz, who is our discussant. She's a professor of political science at Queens College and City University of New York, but also is a resident of Princeton and also very much involved in our community here. She's a political scientist whose research focuses on elections and campaigns, political behavior, and the like. And she's the author of 3 books, amongst many other articles. Let me just note one is The Competitive Elections in the American Voter. Another is Campaigns and Elections, Rules, Reality, Strategy, and Choice. And a third is Democracy at Risk. So we're going to bring a political scientist to the table to engage in these conversations. But Keena also is very multidisciplinary in her orientation, having collaborated and written with scholars and colleagues across the board, including in engineering. And so we are ready for a really interesting conversation. Overall, we're teeing up interesting debates about polarization, institutions, and norms. And we really want to thank them for coming here. So Sam will speak first. Keena then will follow up. They will then come up to this table, and we'll go forward. One final thing, which is that some of our seminars are taped. This is one of those seminars that's actually being taped, so I want you to be mindful of the fact that we're taping, and it will ultimately be posted online. And with that, let's give them a warm applause.
We'll just be in the booth. There's a movie, and I'm going to need you to play. When I ask her, I'm going to need you to play the movie, okay? Oh, I can do it from here.
Yes, do you need to connect this?
No. I just, when the time comes, will I be able to play the movie from here?
Yes, you should be able to.
Okay, terrific. All right.
And if not, I'll be back there. So.
Thanks very much. Good to see you. All right. Okay, thanks very much for coming out this week after the election. Very timely at this moment in American history. I apologize that Simon's not here. I've been working with Simon for a couple of years now, and it's been a real pleasure. And I feel not entirely equal to the task of showing how he views these problems. But I'm going to do my best, and hopefully you'll get a small snapshot of a small perspective on how he sees things. Okay, our topic today is at its root political polarization, which is a topic that is very much on people's minds these days. And I want to do something kind of go all the way from mathematical biology and ecology and how assemblages of people and animals and even molecules work together to generate what are called emergent phenomena. And then I want to zoom in and get very specific on the topic of our destination topic today, political polarization, and hopefully even end up with what we can do about it and ways to understand it better to eventually bring about practical solutions to these problems. So it's an ambitious topic, and in 40 minutes, who knows, maybe we'll get partway there. So as Simon puts it here, the topics that he knits together in his view are public goods, social externalities, and political polarization. And so if I could go ahead and have the next slide, or do I do that here? I can do it. Okay, all right, good. Okay, so the way that Simon would put it is that public goods problems come up all the time in nature. They come up, down here in the lower left is an example of a tragedy of the commons, which is a phrase popularized by Hardin. The idea that a pasture can be grazed over and then no longer usable by anyone. And then on the right, I believe, is a termite mound that Carol Levin took a photograph of, and this is an example of a social good that came together from termites cooperating with one another. And so that would be a positive social good that comes together. And Darwin noticed that these things came up over and over again. And so in a widespread sense, public goods problems are not constrained to our species. They appear in species, all kinds of species, in all kinds of ecological contexts. Now, erosion of public goods threatens our security. If you think about the kinds of resources we have in the world, we have natural capital, which the sustainability of which has become a real issue in recent years. And this unusual period of relative world peace that we had in the last half century or so is a public good that perhaps we take for granted or we under-notice because of the conflicts that do exist around the world that, of course, we are very concerned about. And today, our topic is democratic governance. And just on the right here is this slide here is a graph showing one kind of public good that is starting to become scarce. The idea that in Middle East and North African lands, the renewable resources are starting to deplete, and that is for a variety of reasons. But this is an example of a crisis that's become quite prominent in recent years. Now, today the topic is democratic governance. And democratic governance, too, is something that's eroding worldwide. And this is a worldwide survey that's done of democratic norms, and this is an index of democracy index score that showed a slight improvement in 2022, but actually has been generally on the decline since 2006. And you can see here that the United States, where we live, is classified here as a flawed democracy, and I think probably most of us in this room would probably agree with that. And we're about to learn more about that in the next few years, I think. But the idea here is that you can see that there's a variety of nations that call themselves democracies or do not call themselves democracies. And you can see that there is a pretty large range of authoritarian countries around the world. So this erosion is a public good that is, in fact, of significant concern. Now, here in the United States, this is a little bit more complicated, and it's also not entirely up to date. But you can see here that, in fact, this has been a time of a lot of change in the United States. You see this dark green curve that is attractively increasing. So let's focus on the positive. Political participation went up during the first Trump administration. Their index of government integrity that's gone down a bit. But you can see here that there have been a lot of changes against a downward trajectory. And you know, this graph is incomplete. And I will say that one question is, where is this graph naturally headed in the next few years? And then the second question is, what can we do to nudge this graph and perhaps get it to move in a direction that is to the benefit of as many people as possible in the United States and in the world? So to zoom out to a theoretical point, this is just a broad point that goes well beyond the particular crisis of democracy, that the world is filled with complex adaptive systems. And generally speaking, I want you to think just very generally about any kind of ecological system, a democracy, a school of fish, you know, I don't know, molecules in a gas, as being heterogeneous collections of individual units, and in the case of living things, agents, that interact locally and evolve based on the outcome. So you can imagine, for instance, that if you have fish that can only see the fish next to them and see that the fish next to them is a certain orientation, and then the fish says, okay, I'll face the same way. Even though that fish cannot see other fish that are very far away, the emergent phenomenon is it forms a school of fish that's all going in one direction, and you can get flocking behavior, schooling behavior. And that's an example of an emergent phenomenon that is driven by individual interactions, and the evolution of the entire system is based on the outcomes of those interactions. And I want you to think about democracy as being one of these systems that we'll get into, hopefully, in the next few minutes in discussion with Keena Lipsitz. So emergence comes up in all kinds of problems. And just to give you one more example, economic behavior is similarly an emergent phenomenon. And so economics comes from, you know, everything from microeconomic behavior, where we make decisions about how to spend our money, how we're feeling, how happy we are, how sad we are in our personal lives, the things that we encounter in our environments, and all kinds of factors. And eventually they merge to form this emergent phenomenon of macroeconomic behavior. And so if you imagine the decisions that you make about whether to buy gas, or how you feel about the price of eggs, or whatever it might be, or how you feel about your family situation, whatever it might be, you and millions of others are making those decisions. And together they form the animal spirits of the entire economy. Now, what I would say is that Simon is interested in, and I am interested in, the same approach. And this is really what drew us together as collaborators. The idea that it is possible to have macroscopic features. If we could understand these local interactions, maybe we could have some insights into where the emergent phenomena come from, right? So political scientists have certainly been doing this quite a lot over the decades and the centuries. And we come at it from a mathematical biology standpoint of understanding these interacting agents and trying to understand what the irreducible components are that lead to the large-scale macroscopic features. And so, you know, on the one hand, we care very much about the macroscopic features. On the other hand, we hope to capture the essentials and figure out which components are essential, and then thereby have a proper theory of where these macroscopic emergent phenomena, such as political polarization, come from. And then thereby, as I said, understand causes, understand how those causes link to effects, and hopefully understand how perturbations and interventions could also perhaps make a small difference. Now, okay, so I already mentioned the tragedy of the commons. This is a phrase originated by Garrett Hardin, and he proposed in I think, a rigorous game theoretic sense that if we all have some common resource and we are rewarded by taking a little bit of that resource, and there's no immediate motivation to replenish that resource, then that commons gets depleted. And so that was a pioneering idea by Garrett Hardin. To some extent, this was countered or expanded by Elinor Ostrom, and Professor Ostrom got the Nobel Prize in Economics for understanding ways in which societies can cooperate, ways in which agents can work together, and this idea of somehow improving the commons through interactions, through a phrase that here is mutual coercion, but mutually agreed upon. So if we agree to form a society and we agree to abide by those norms, then it's possible to create a society that enriches the commons. And that is a central challenge of how to build a democracy and how to keep it strong. So, so I would say that here, this is an article that Naomi Leonard and Simon wrote together on collective intelligence as a public good. And so what they claim and what I present to you is that what's needed at this point at this juncture in our history is cooperation in the public good, some kind of collective intelligence that is greater than the intelligence of us as individuals, because we are forced to live with one another. And so if we can find some way to live together collectively, then that would lead to that collective good. And a dose of pro-sociality in helping to deal with kinds of inequities that come up. Here shown in the slide is intergenerational, so across the country, across different economic strata, but also between generations, right? Changes that happen over time. And instead, what we have is the opposite. We have phenomena that are well known, I think, to everyone in this room. Extreme nationalist movements, which we've seen around the world, as Deborah has pointed out. This is the year of elections, and and over again, a theme is nationalism that's emerged in various ways across the globe in different countries and on different continents. And of course, political polarization. And so there's this general question, why is this happening everywhere? It can't just be because of trans issues in schools or whatever it might be, because it's a phenomenon that's happening everywhere. So there's something globally happening, and it's like we have all these, I don't know, to make a physics analogy, we have these pistons, and the piston is getting hotter and the gas is getting compressed all over the world. So what is the common theme that's going on there? And so one hopes that it might be possible to come up with some common causes that transcend the specific issues that come up in our country and in other countries. Not to belittle those issues, but they are clearly important details, but they might not be at the root of what's going on. Okay, so the question is there a solution? Now, as I've already told you, political polarization is on the increase and threatens democratic governance. This is a slide and a report that came out before last week's election, but I think this report is perhaps more timely than ever. But the idea that there's increasing ideological uniformity within groups, say within political parties, and antipathy between the major parties in the United States. And this report I recommend to you as a report that summarizes how these qualities affect politics, compromise, and even everyday life. For those of you who vote here in Princeton Township, you know that even school board elections can be subject to these national forces. And so these things come up over and over and over again at every level. And so, like Tolstoy said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Okay, so here's Simon. This is all you get of Simon, so take a good look at that photograph. There he is. Simon has, as I said, been interested in this for increasingly in the last few years, and I had the pleasure of attending a conference in Arizona a few years ago, and Keena and I were, how many years ago was that conference? In the before time, yeah. But that conference and another sibling conference here at Princeton led to a special issue of PNAS, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, all about the dynamics of political polarization. And these three members of the Academy, Simon, Helen Milner, and Charles Perrings, put together a series of contributions by us, Keena and me, and a cast of all-stars, all looking at political polarization in their own way from political science and from other disciplines, trying to understand what it is that causes this polarization and what its consequences are. And there's an idea I want to introduce here. The idea I want to introduce is the idea of low dimensionality. And so this is an article that George Hagstrom and Simon wrote together the idea that dynamics can become unstable under certain circumstances. So imagine a complex system that moves in many dimensions, like there's lots of things it can do, whatever it may be, a school of fish or a political system. And now imagine everything in that system starting to move in one dimension. Okay, so in physics, we would call that a manifold, a one-dimensional path, and everything is forced to stay along that single dimension. When dynamics are forced to go along a single dimension, there's no place for the dynamics to go. And so you might imagine, for instance, that a school of fish, if they're swimming at random without regard to one another, they're not going to get very far. But if they swim together with local interactions, the emergent phenomenon is that their movement becomes one-dimensional and in a single path sense, so not a straight line, but a manifold, a path, in which they can start making some progress and go someplace. So the general idea in this article is that there are precursors of critical transitions that come from the following idea. When you have a one-dimensional system and dynamics are forced to go along that system, instability can result. Because on the one hand, you can make progress. On the other hand, you might end up someplace really unexpected. And so in the dynamics of a complex system, if you have a single-dimensional manifold, you can imagine that maybe an avalanche could result. Or in heart tissue, a heart attack might result. Or in a society, a political revolution might result. And so when we have single-dimensional dynamics, unexpected things can happen, and sometimes they can be catastrophic. And if you think about political polarization as it is now in the United States and in other countries, you can see the beginnings of, I think, where we're headed today in this discussion, the idea that dynamics start falling along a single dimension, as we've seen over the last 30 years or so, right? I would personally characterize it as really picking up steam in the mid-90s, that that low-dimensional manifold is a physics way or a mathematical biology way of thinking about where we've gotten. Now, I would say that this is not just an abstraction and not just an academic exercise. My hope is to show you that this is also a powerful way to think about political dynamics and a way to, for a math nerd like me, to understand many of the findings that have emerged from political science and turn them into a theory that we in our little corner of knowledge could understand as a way of modeling the entire system as a complex system and understanding how we got here and where we might go next. And so I hope that what I'm going to show you is something that's complementary to all the knowledge that's come before from complex systems and also from political science. So I think Keena, Professor Lipsitz, is going to get into this a little bit, so I will just use this as put a pin in something for us to think about, that there are different ways to think about polarization. So if you don't think about it for a living, I want you to think about different ways of thinking about polarization. This is a book that Nolan McCarty over in Politics in SPIA wrote about, and this is a whole book about polarization, so I recommend it to you. But one kind of polarization is, I think, one that comes to mind, which is ideological. How do you feel about abortion? How do you feel about guns? How do you feel about Ukraine? How do you feel about Gaza? Okay, so there's different ways that we can think about polarization that are focused on issues. And let us call that whole collection of attitudes ideological. And it can be different kinds of polarization. It can be how much do you trust authority? Or it can be, how do you care more about your neighbors or about people far away from you? There's different ways to think about polarization, and some of them are ideological. Another way to think about polarization is something that I think that has probably been really, in many ways, quite wrenching over the last few decades, affective polarization. The idea that it's not just that I feel a certain way about an issue, it's that I feel very positively about my side, and I feel very negatively about your side. And if you look back in the 1990s, some of the political language that was introduced by the strategist Frank Luntz involved things like calling the opponents sick and twisted. Right? If you think about that, those were things that were not said at all by Republican Minority Leader Bob Michel, but Newt Gingrich, who eventually became Speaker of the House, was embraced those words, like the idea that by using affect, you could then polarize voters so that a voter might say, you know what, I'm not 100% sure I like my side, but that other side, oh, they're a bunch of degenerates. I'm not going to vote for them. And whichever side you may be on, I hope I've described this in a way that captures, you can imagine supporters of either major political party having a sentiment like what I just said. So both ideological and affective polarization are associated with a loss of dimensionality and extreme spread along one or a small number of axes. There are ways in which this can be measured. I think Keena will talk about that a bit. There are ways which they can be measured that we're working on right now. There's a lot of survey data, and where I'm headed in today's talk presentation is to show you how you can actually get this out of real voting behavior. So not just from survey data, which is the classical central tool in the kit of political scientists, but I'm going to show you how actual voting data can be used to extract the same concept. But the idea that dimensionality in American politics has gone low, and we are along a single axis or a single path, a single manifold in space. So some polarization is likely to be good. So for instance, it's helpful to have a choice between parties, and it's helpful to have a contrast of choices. These are political contests are made of these contrasts. As Barry Goldwater said, a choice, not an echo. But too much polarization could be destructive to societies. And I think a good question right now at this point in American history is how much polarization is too much, and is there something that can be done about it? This is just to remind me to tell you about some of the many good things that are in this issue of PNAS, and I really encourage it to you. It's a virtual online issue. I tried without luck to get a hard copy of the whole issue, but it just goes to show that I'm kind of old-fashioned. But here is one of multiple articles. This one's interesting because it's about a variety of factors, but including spatial clustering. And if you think about the rural-urban divide that has emerged in US politics, that perhaps is relevant to this particular study done by these collaborators here about segregation and clustering of preferences and how that clustering of preferences can erode socially beneficial coordination. And so this is just one example of ways in which it's helpful to, in some ways, abstract the nature of polarization, and without getting into the details, whether they be about COVID or guns or whatever it might be, that there's this broad principle that as we come to live further apart from one another, which Bill Bishop called the big sort, and which researchers have delved into over in the decades since that book came out, the idea that in fact that big sort could be a root cause of where we are now in terms of polarization. Now, I want to now turn to now that I've set the stage using Simon's slides, I'm now going to turn to my slides, and I'm going to show you now how my students and I have been starting to work on the question of political polarization, and we have practical ambitions. And so for purposes of today, I decided to call this talk "A Republic If We Can Keep It." This is a famous saying that emerged at the founding. And what I'm hoping to show you is some way of whether the tools get used or not, I cannot say, but at least to understand the phenomena and to at least begin the concept of building a science of democracy repair. And I'm purposely using the word repair and not reform because reform has political valence, but repair, certainly I think, is understandable, right? Like there are things that are not quite working right, looking a little bit rickety, maybe we'd like to repair them. And it's not that we want a particular political outcome, it's that we want the system to continue working, right? So, if you voted for, a meta vote, you may have voted for the ability to vote again in the future. And that ability to vote again in the future involves having a system in which all the major players in the system are willing to admit the possibility that they might lose. And so democracy in its core means a system that's responsive to the voters and representative of the voters. And so that's where I'm headed to get in the remaining minutes. Okay, so just to remind you, we live in a somewhat unusual political time. This is now a graph. I haven't had time to update it to make it pretty. You can see that I added something to it that goes off the edge of the graph. I apologize at the homeliness of this graph. But this is a graph of presidential elections from John Quincy Adams to the second election of Donald Trump. And this is the popular vote margin of whoever ended up becoming president. And so the idea here is that we live in a period of close presidential elections where the popular vote has been within 5 points in 6 out of the last 7 elections, and this last one was a real close one, looking like less than 2 percentage points, about 1 percentage point. And you can see here that the red dots are even times when the popular vote loser became president, whether it be John Quincy Adams on the left, or Rutherford Hayes and Benjamin Harrison in the first Gilded Age, and then George W. Bush and the first Trump presidency in the second, let's call it perhaps the second Gilded Age. So the reason I'm showing this to you is to remind you that we live in a pretty unusual time. Elections have been on a knife edge, not just the presidency, but also control of Congress. So control of Congress changed multiple times during the first Gilded Age. And this has to do with close national votes among people who were allowed to vote back then and among people who voted this time. During those times, elections have been actually quite close. But in addition to that, we also have these other themes that I think are familiar to all of you, themes of racial division, technological disruption, increasing inequality, and deep partisanship. And I should add to this that this time around, there's a strong separation in issues between the major parties where there's very little overlap. And what that means is that a small change in vote can lead to a large change in policy outcome. And if you think about what just happened last week, it's a close election. The House couldn't be more closely divided. The presidency was decided by fewer than 100 electoral votes. That was a close election. And yet the consequences are, going to be pretty profound. And so that idea of a small change in vote leading to a large change in outcome illustrates the kind of instability that can result when you have a system that in fact rewards, winning by any means. It makes me think of, we were talking before and about in some Hemingway story or novel, the question, how did you go bankrupt? Well, gradually and then suddenly. Okay, so, we might be at the sudden part now. So there's different ways to look at this. The January 6th insurrection was a profound event in American politics and one that I think really shaped a lot of people's thinking about where we're headed. And I really recommend to you this article that came out just 3 days after it, which I, was quite surprised to see it come out so suddenly. But as I've come to learn about the work of Timothy Snyder, he's somebody who's really understood these things quite well. He's the author of the book On Tyranny. And you can see here, these are people who feel left out in one way or another. Whatever the merits of their positions are, these are people who feel that the system's not working for them, and they feel that they deserve to win, and they feel that they were robbed, and they wanted to do whatever it took to win. So that's one path that we could go down. There it is. Then another path down here is a path that I would characterize as one driven by reform. This is a candidate forum at an Alaska congressional forum several years ago, at which Sarah Palin ran against Nick Begich and Mary Peltola, two Republicans and one Democrat, although Peltola worked for a Republican congressman for many years. And so here they are taking a selfie together. And if you've been following American politics, you might be a little bit surprised to see Sarah Palin taking a selfie with someone of the opposing party. And one of the things that happened during this was that there was an implementation of a particular reform called ranked choice voting, which I will come back to. But it was a special primary system called Top 4, in which everyone ran in one primary, and it was a special decision rule called ranked choice voting. And after just the second iteration of this rule, Palin started buddying up to two people who she was saying bad things about. I mean, I got to say, there was a triangular, it was like that end scene from Reservoir Dogs. It was like, there was a lot of hostility between people the first time around, but it actually got a little bit better the second time around. And so one question is it possible to perform an intervention that goes from what's on the left here to what's on the right? Okay, so I want to now introduce to you a paradox, and this paradox is we're polarized, but yet many of us are independents. How many of you, just curious, how many of you, you don't have to answer if you don't want to, this is, how many of you are registered neither Democratic nor Republican, but are registered as unaffiliated with either major party? Okay, some. All right, it's interesting, fewer than I would have expected. I will say that that right now, in the most recent Gallup survey, 51% of respondents report themselves to be neither Democrats nor Republicans. And that means that they outnumber Democrats and Republicans combined in the United States. And that's something that has emerged this year. And you can see that this dotted line, which is independence, has gone up and up and up. And the most recent result is 51%. So this is a funny paradox. 51% of people say that they're independent, but we're really polarized. And there's affective polarization and issue polarization. So what, we hate each other, we think the other side is scum, or pardon me, That'll be the strongest word I use today, I hope. But but at the same time, 51% report that they're independent. How can that possibly be? And I want to show you how that could possibly be. So imagine, this is just a simple visualization. Imagine that we have, let's see if I can do this myself. This is very exciting. Okay, great. So imagine voters piled up in a histogram, and you might imagine, and this kind of histogram will become more familiar to you, perhaps with Keena's slides, but imagine us piled up in two great piles on the histogram, on the left and on the right, ideologically separated from another. So, but now imagine that actually we're more complex than that as a people, that we are in fact, let me see if we can do this. Okay, this is like gonna be, can I do it? Yeah, okay, it's playing. All right, so imagine now that we're actually multidimensional. In fact, some of us are not in one of those two mountains. So some of us are in this third mountain. Now, I've shown this third mountain as being smaller than the other two, but these are voters who are perhaps unrepresented by the two major mountains. It's a polarized system, and they don't really feel like they're part of either, but they still have to choose. And if you imagine a single axis, then they have to make a choice where they have to project whatever their hopes and dreams and views are onto the principal dimension. And that dimension is this principal dimension of polarization. And so they get forced to choose. So it's possible to be heterogeneous in our views, and yet also be forced to choose in a system. And if the rules of the system force us to choose, then it creates a problem. It creates tension in the system. And so this visualization is to just show you that idea. Now, I would posit to you, and this is me coming as a non-political scientist, just naive ideas about what we would want out of a democracy. We might want a democracy to represent us. And so for years, I worked on gerrymandering, and I'm going to say something contrary, perhaps suitable for discussion later. In some ways, the gerrymandering problem has been actually addressed in many ways in the last 10 years. Not every way. There are some pretty bad gerrymanders in the US. But representation is one way in which we would like our democracy to work for us. We'd like to be represented. And there's been improvement in that domain. We'd like the system to be responsive to us. And as you've heard me say, responsive, but maybe not too responsive. And the question is hyper-responsive, right? In neurology, we refer to reflexes as being hyper-reflexive. You want to have a reflex, but if you've ever been to a neurology exam, being hyper-reflexive is not a good sign. It's too much reflex. And finally, deliberative. We'd like our democracy, our system to be deliberative and resolve issues at the hands of the people who we elect. So how could we build those using the rules of the system? This is now a math person's view of what political scientists think about how the system works. And this is done with Professor Lipsitz and also with Bernie Grofman at UC Irvine and Jonathan Servas at Carnegie Mellon University. And this is basically civics as seen by an engineer, where the engineer looks at the system and says, okay, there are two things that may have an action on one another that's positive. So for instance, voter polarization might lead to state legislators being polarized, and then the legislators and other elites may in fact get voters to be revved up. And so those are pointy arrows. Redistricting you can see here as a positive feedback loop where a legislature can ensconce itself in power by drawing its own map. So these are examples of positive feedback loops that when they run away could lead to instability. But you can also see checks on power. The governor vetoing something that the legislature passes, or perhaps the Senate vetoing something the president wants to do, like say appoint someone to the cabinet or whatever it might be. And so these kinds of inhibitions are inhibitory steps that foster stability, but of course they can also lead to inaction. And one of the difficulties of designing such a system is making it responsive to what voters want, but not too responsive. And of course, if one takes things out, the thing can work better, but it doesn't necessarily work better. If you've ever had the experience of taking something apart and putting it back together, you might, whether it be a watch or a toaster or something in your car, sometimes you take it apart and you put it back together, and it seems to work a little faster. It seems to work better. Like I've had this experience, and my general experience is that is a temporary phenomenon. But if you take out, it would be attractive to take some of these inhibitory steps out. The anti-gerrymandering efforts of the last 5 years have been adding inhibitory steps. Okay, so what I want to do in the last few minutes is show you some evidence about ranked choice voting. This is an article by our former colleague Anne-Marie Slaughter, and Professor Slaughter and Simon have worked together on various kinds of reform. And one reform that's caught the attention of a lot of people who want to make democracy work better is the idea of ranked choice voting. The idea that if you, rather than just express one choice at the ballot box, you might like to express your first choice. If your first choice doesn't make it, then you mark your second choice, third choice, and so on. And if you make those rankings, and there's a rule for tabulating and accounting for those rankings, then you pick a winner, then it's possible to devise a rule that then leads to the most people being happy or the least people being unhappy, depending how you look at it. And this idea of ranked choice voting is something that's really gotten bigger and bigger in the last few years, and has become a desired reform by a lot of people who would like government to work a little bit better for them, at least through electoral rules. And so one question that is of great interest, I think, is, does ranked choice voting reduce polarization? So you can imagine it could achieve various kinds of things. It could get candidates to campaign in a more positive manner, to seek one another's votes, supporters, that is. It could, for instance, motivate candidates, give them an incentive to run towards the center. Okay, it could leave the possibility of voters getting more representation, even if they're somewhat heterodox in their views, and then they're in that third mountain, they still get some amount of say in the system. And so you can imagine the kinds of benefits that could come out of ranked choice voting. And the question is, do those benefits emerge, and also how big are those benefits? And there's a practical question in the last few years, which is, what if voters don't want that particular reform? Is there something that can do as well? And that's really where I want to go in the last few minutes. So the existing system, which I think we all know, is you have a closed primary where each party nominates one person. Democrats nominate one, Republicans nominate one, and then they run against one another in a general election. And this is just, I'm a little out of order here, but this left-hand histogram here is some empirical data that we've gotten from voting records on how people are polarized. But imagine if people are polarized into these two great mountains of left and right, of Democrats and Republicans. If you just have two candidates, then in our simulations, we've set conditions so that each candidate wins about half the time. And, I should have changed this. This is outdated. It's supposed to say D and R, not Biden and Trump. But imagine if you have a simple system with just two candidates, then perhaps 50% of the vote is required to win. But now imagine if there's a third candidate. And there's been a desire in some quarters to run a third candidate. And the naive view is, if we had a third party, that person could just be at the sensible middle. And if we had that, then everything would be lovely. And then we'd have a middle candidate and everything would be hunky-dory and we wouldn't have to have this terrible polarization. So under simple simulation conditions, the result is a little different from that. And the result is that this middle, imagine a candidate running here towards the middle in this kind of beige zone. If a candidate's in this zone, what they can do is they can create an asymmetry where one of the candidates ends up winning and not needing 50% of the vote anymore, and the other candidate still wins 50%. The general principle, which I think anyone could understand if they thought about it a little bit, is that if you run someone who's in the middle between two candidates, that candidate tends to act to damage the prospects of the person they're closer to. And so if you think about Robert F. Kennedy Jr., when he was running for president this year, when he was thought to be closer to Biden or Harris, then he was deemed, if you think about it, he was likely to hurt that candidate. And you only hurt the one you love. And so then if you think about Kennedy then being seen as being closer to Trump, then therefore closer to Trump. And if you watch the machinations of the campaigns, that explains certainly why, from a strategic point of view, the Trump campaign was very interested in sidelining Kennedy towards the closing stages of the campaign. So this is just a simple point that using the existing rules of the system, we might want a savior, but that savior might end up spoiling the prospects of what we really wanted to happen in the first place. And so under the existing rules of the system, a savior can become a spoiler. Okay, now this is not always the case. If we were not so polarized, if we run again these simulations now with less polarization towards the extremes, less bimodality, it becomes a system in which there are more voters collected at the middle, and now it's possible for that third party to sometimes win elections, and now there's still some measure of symmetry between the two major parties. And so one question is, under certain circumstances, this third party idea might backfire. Under other circumstances, it might not backfire. And so this is one question that has been of really great interest to us as we've been working on this. Now, one of the reforms that has attracted a lot of interest is the idea of a top four primary. For those of you who don't know about this, this is a rule that is currently implemented in Maine and Alaska and actually newly enacted, I think, in Washington, D.C. this year. the idea that everybody runs in one great big primary. So if you're independent, Democratic, Republican, you just vote. You check off who your favorite candidate is. The top 4 advance to the general election and then vote by ranked choice. Just some simple envelope calculations suggest that the number of competitive congressional districts, as I mentioned, that amount of competition has gone up in the last round of redistricting. And if even 1 in 20 partisan voters had complex preferences, such a reform could double the number of competitive seats. And so this is one possible way in which competition could be improved. So this is just one possibility. The bad news is that this reform, in fact, got a sound thrashing at the ballot box last week. And so there are democracy reforms on the ballot all over the nation. You can look them up at your leisure at this resource that I was linked with, that I helped create, votemaximizer.org. And there were reforms on the ballot all over the country. Things like letting everybody run in one primary, ranked choice voting, or nonpartisan redistricting. As it turns out, most of these reforms failed last week. And one of the problems right now is that reform itself, so remember I've been switching back and forth between the word repair and reform. Reform itself has adopted a partisan valence. And here, if you look over here, these are the vote shares of these various reforms. And you can see here, I will tell you that the Pearson correlation between the Harris vote share and the vote for electoral reform, that Pearson correlation is, I think, 0.89 or so. And so it's highly positively correlated, where 1 is perfect correlation. And you can see here that it's correlated, but it is weaker. It ran on, these reforms on average ran 5 points weaker than Democratic vote share. Now that's just as a contrast, abortion initiatives, right, ran 11 points ahead of Democratic vote share. So this is, in short, a graph in which reproductive rights are apparently bipartisan and favorable to voters of both parties. And then these repairs to democracy that I mentioned are bipartisan, but there's skepticism. And so there's a current challenge to persuading voters. And so this leads to a couple of problems. One is, okay, maybe it's a persuasion problem. Another is, well, maybe it's the wrong reform. And these 2 filled circles here are interesting because they represent things that did better than Democratic vote share and therefore might have had some kind of cross-party appeal. And these 2 filled circles are letting everybody run in one great big primary and also nonpartisan redistricting reform. And so they failed, but they ran ahead of the Democratic vote share. And so this is just to show you that there's complexity that needs to be addressed. Now, in the last couple minutes, I just want to show you something, a thing we're doing, and in a very researchy talk, I would have really focused on this. What we're doing is we're currently analyzing hundreds of hundreds of ranked choice elections in which instant runoff voting was analyzed. It was used in the election. And in those hundreds of elections, we've been using dimensionality reduction techniques to put all the candidates and all the voters on a single axis. So that red X there, imagine that's you. If you're that red X, then you might prefer candidate A to candidate B, and then you might prefer B to C and D, and you might cast the ballot A, B, C, D. But you could also imagine if you're somewhere over at this end of the axis, your ordering is D, C, B, A. And in both cases, your ordering is quite different, and yet you both have the same view. And what this refers to is the idea that voters may have a single cognitive space in which they all view the candidates the same way. And we find that statistically, voters tend to act as if they view the candidates on one axis. This is a congressional election from a few years ago in Maine, and you can see here, this is a histogram of how the voters are, and you can see here in this particular example, the voters are bimodally arranged between the Democratic candidate, Jared Golden, and the Republican candidate, Bruce Poliquin, and an independent candidate in between. So we have a finding that if we analyze hundreds of these elections, we find that in partisan elections, which is the red histogram here, voters act more bimodal. They act more like they're piled up in these 2 big mountains. If it's a nonpartisan election, they act less that way, and in primaries, less still. And then likewise on the right, we take those elections and we sort them by US Senate versus more local elections. We can again see differences in the degree of polarization. And so the idea here is that voters act less polarized in nonpartisan and local races. And so we feel that that's probably an important starting point in starting to ask the question, okay, now that we understand how voters act in different kinds of elections, we can start asking questions like, how would they behave if we gave them a new rule? If we gave them approval voting as a rule, or if we gave them a top 2 primary as a rule, or whatever it might be. And so we're hoping to use this as a starting point to understand the hypothetical effects of future reforms and hopefully using agent-based modeling to understand what may happen in the future. And our feeling is that I would say that we feel more urgency on this particular project than we did even a few weeks ago, because these reforms, if they are to deliver the promise of reduced polarization in the US politics, seems like might be a good idea to do that. Toot sweet. Okay, so we're starting to look at similarities. This is now into the weeds. I won't get into it because it looks like I'm out of time. But this is now representing all those hundreds of elections, and the similarity of two elections are similar to another, then we put them next to each other. And if they're less similar, they're further apart. This is a way of representing all the hundreds of elections in a single plot that is commonplace in quantitative biology. It's a kind of clustering called T-SNE. It's like neighbor embedding. But anyway, the idea here is that certain kinds of elections seem to be similar to each other, like board elections or representative elections or US Senate elections. And these spectra that we're calling them are similar to one another if the election is similar to one another. And so this is our beginning point for doing simulations in the future. With that, I thank you very much. This is now supporters of mostly Simon's research. He and I are both supported by the generosity of the Princeton Catalysis Initiative, and of course we're both very fortunate to be here at Princeton University. And then Simon has been supported over the years and currently by these other organizations. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry, that's in your way.
That's yours.
That's my notes. I apologize.
And I'm seeing something very technical here. I'm not seeing actually a computer screen, so.
Yeah, it's a little discomforting.
Do I just exit this?
I don't know.
Sorry. Great. And just start running.
There you go.
Hello, my name is Keena Lipsitz, and I want to thank Deborah today for having me here, and for Sam and Simon allowing me to respond. I should say I am very much, I'm a collaborator of Sam's, right? We've been on papers together. I also was part of the Polarization workshop that Simon put together. So I'm still working on these projects, but I wanted to talk today about, what is keeping me up at night. And I thought I would talk about this. This is what kept me up last night. Okay. And the reason why I want to talk about Matt Getz is because something that I've been thinking a lot about, and this has to do with a project I did with Naomi Leonard in the engineering department, is it's polarization, but also about norms and political norms. So norms are ways of behaving appropriate, or understanding of appropriate behavior. And a lot of times those norms are they're unspoken, right? It's just you observe people around you and how they behave, and that is what you accept as being what you should do, right? And so norms come from a lot of places, not just people around you. Maybe there are certain groups that you identify with, maybe partisan groups you identify with that can shape how you behave. And then elected officials are also affected by the norms of their office. And so those norms are set by their predecessors, right? And so the thing, after I was somebody knocking on doors in Bucks County for 2 months, and so I kind of was prepared for this election, but I was not prepared for this. And the reason why is, if you think back to when Trump appointed Jeff Sessions to be Attorney General, the one sort of norm violation that everybody was in a tizzy about was that he didn't have an Ivy League diploma. That was the concern, right? And so here we have probably the most unqualified person who has ever been nominated to be Attorney General. I mean, he has a couple things in common with his predecessors. He's white, he's a male, and he has practiced law. But he has no prosecutorial experience, and he's also, he's never been a judge, right? And he's also somebody who's been under investigation by the Justice Department himself. So this is a pretty egregious norm violation to propose somebody like him. And then on top of it, the way that he is going to be probably, I think, that he's going to be pushed through is through recess appointments. And so, recess appointments, they're in the Constitution. A president has that power, and presidents have used them. Obama used them, Bush used them, but the Senate has pushed back by basically not having prolonged recess appointments. And that way, they've sort of held on to their power to check presidential power or the nomination process. And what is very likely going to happen here, and we've seen President Trump already pushing for that, is that you're going to have recess appointments. These nominations, these candidates are not going to go through the normal process. So this brings me back, we've seen these norm violations piling up over time, and they have come from both sides. Here we have, Pelosi tearing up, it was President Trump's speech during his first State of the Union address. That had never happened before. In fact, actually, what was interesting is Matt Gaetz was the one who, he filed a complaint with the Ethics Committee for this, saying that it was a flagrant violation of decorum. So just interesting. And then we have under Biden, during the State of the Union address, we had Boebert jumping up and down, screaming liar. Okay, so you've had these kinds of norm violations, but they've been getting more and more egregious. And so that brings me to polarization. So Sam, sorry, it's the S's, Sam. This is showing you how polarized the electorate and elites are in terms of both ideological and affective polarization, right? And so on the top, you have the masses, and you have on the left issue-based, that's ideological polarization, and on the right, you have the affective polarization, right? Which is the dislike, the loathing. And what's interesting is you have it actually compared with elites, and you see elites on both measures on the bottom, both ideologically and in terms of affect, are even more polarized than the public, right? And what does that lead to, particularly affective polarization? Is it leads to the norm breakage, the norm violations, right? So not only, if you dislike the other side, you get people saying, okay, well, we're justified in doing this because the other side is evil, right? And then on top of it, it also reduces accountability for actions. So you get not only people, citizens in the party saying, well, it's fine if Trump has this kind of nomination, that's fine. But also within the own party, that reduces accountability as well. And so, when you think of, egregious norm violators in the past, the Joseph McCarthy's, the Nixons, some of the loudest critics came from within their own party. And that's what made, bringing them down sort of credible. We now have the Republican Party is essentially the party of Trump. And so you can't count on the party for holding him accountable. And so rebuilding norms is very difficult. I just really loved this moment from one of the recent, the last debate. I don't know if you know, under Biden, the debates that he and Trump had, they never shook hands. And so Harris was determined. She chased him across the stage, and you can see he's not happy about it at all, right? But there was a lot of risk involved in that, right? She could have been refused. He could have somehow tried to humiliate her, right? So the point is, norms are really hard to rebuild. And the thing is, and this is from the project that I did with Naomi, is that polarization it's not going away, and it's getting worse. And so what we did, and this is what I love about the models that people like Simon and Naomi use, is that they allow for feedback, positive feedback. The idea that you have one thing leads to another, and that thing, again, comes back around and keeps pushing it forward. And so you have these processes they're not linear, right? And I think in political science, we tend to use more linear models. And so what this is showing here is we were trying to understand the asymmetry in polarization. This happened to be ideological polarization. And what we know is that Republicans have moved more to the right than Democrats. And what we did in our models, we brought together public opinion, an aggregate measure, which is called policy mood, which shifts back and forth over time. So usually what happens is that when Democrats are in power, policy mood becomes more conservative, and when conservatives or Republicans are in power, policy mood becomes more liberal. And so it's like this sort of counterweight. And what's been happening is public opinion is not functioning in the way that it has. And so it's become slightly more conservative. And then that combined with the feedback that you get on both sides, when you think about feedback, that's the money, the social media, the party discipline, all of those things that sort of keep driving the polarization. What our model shows is public opinion is the feedback is the polarization is too far gone to be pulled back, at least not by public opinion anymore, right? And so, Matt Getz to me is very much explained by this. And so when I let's come back, we'll come back. We'll come back to him. When I think about all of these reforms that we're trying to come up with, he is from a very safe district in Florida. It was won by Trump by over 30 points. He has no real primary competition. So even if you opened up the primary, how do we address this? And so part of me thinks that we should absolutely keep doing this kind of research, but the other part is it just rearranging chairs on the Titanic? So anyway, I will end with that.
We have just about 10 minutes, and so what I'm going to recommend is just to take a round of questions, and then we'll just turn back to the two of you. All right, I'll start. But I do want to just highlight two axes that I hear that are really critical, and then maybe to ask a question that I recognize is impossible to answer. Because one set of themes that was coming through is how do we explain the electoral outcomes that are in play, so why we get one candidate over another, and part of the answer there is that the discussion was about the kinds of institutional changes that might shape the kinds of electoral outcomes. But the second is once people are in power, the modes of accountability that would affect what people do in office. Some of that is institutional, right? So those veto points, that's what we would call them in political science, or the other kinds of mechanisms that Sam noted. The others are about norms, and that's really the point also that Keena was raising. So when I was stepping back, this is a fundamental debate in political science. Institutions versus norms, ideas and interests versus other things, agency versus structure. I guess I was stepping back and thinking, what kinds of perturbations, that's the term that you use, right? So something that disrupts really might shift. And here the question is, to what degree can man-made, women-made, people-made interventions matter as opposed to conditions that we inherit? And so what I mean by the second is sometimes we might say the economic crisis was so severe, it was the economic conditions that led to outcomes. Maybe it's really not about ideology and affect, but maybe it's about just voting the incumbent out because there's other things that are going on. So really the big question that I'm leading to is, as you've thought about your work, to what degree are these perturbations actually human-made versus conditions like economic structure, economic crisis, and the like? So that's my question. I've given you a moment to think. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm Eduardo Batia, visiting professor at SPIA. Wonderful. Thank you so much. My students do a 6-week seminar on polarization, but basically the reaction to polarization. How can societies that have been polarized, have there been case studies of leaders who have taken them out of that polarization? And we look at Northern Ireland, we look at Nelson Mandela, we look at some communities here in the U.S. that have been more polarized than we are here in America right now. And basically the work of a leader or a number of leaders have actually made them get over the finish line. And I wonder if there's something there that you can share with us in terms of, how to, other than the research, how to effectively deal with that.
And then we'll take one more question from Griga.
Thank you. So I guess the question that I have that goes a little bit to both Sam's presentation and Keena's comments is, to what extent we think that some of these electoral reforms that Sam talks about would be able to pull the elites back from this polarization, right? If you have these kinds of open primaries and top four and so on. And then conversely, whether the fact that such reforms might push towards the center might explain why these reforms end up not being very popular, because basically elites that are highly polarized see themselves as potentially losing to more centrist candidates, and what the implications of that are.
Why don't we start with you, Keena?
Okay. So I think Deborah, actually, and maybe Grigo would be better equipped to respond to your question, although that is something that I have thought that actually could, and it's not institutional, it's very individualistic, and we as political scientists don't like individualistic sort of responses, but our political leaders behaving better. Like if you had some, what if all of a sudden Trump tomorrow, started behaving like, a kind person? I think it would have dramatic effects. And there's lots of work that shows in political science that people follow their leader. We all look to these our role models, or not role models, but people we trust, and we behave like they do. We believe the things that they tell us to believe. So I think that could make a difference. I was going to say in response to Grigo, so here's where where Sam and I sometimes run into issues is I am a political scientist. I see all those independents, and my question is, really, are they independent? Because research shows that really only about 7 to 10% of those people are not committed to one party or the other. Most of those independents vote they're just as partisan, or they behave in just as partisan a fashion as people who say that they're with a party. And when I think about the reforms and them being enacted, there's a whole history in this country of Democrats and Republicans basically colluding to shut out third-party competition, right? And so, they don't like these reforms. We have lots of evidence of that now, where they don't like things like RCV. So yes, that is definitely a concern. But Sam.
Yeah, the nice thing about answering a second is it buys a little bit of time to collect thoughts, which is very helpful in this case. So one, to address these questions, first globally with Eduardo's question, and then to go to the United States in particular. To echo Keena's point, elites have a lot of say in what people end up getting. And although it may be that voters in the United States many of them did not necessarily want a huge change, those votes are going to have, in all likelihood, a fairly outsized effect politically. And so when we have elites, if I think, now I'm not a comparativist, I don't know very much about other than what I read in the newspapers, but two examples that come to mind are peacemaking in Northern Ireland and also in the former Yugoslavia, right? So these are places that had fairly intractable conflicts. And then there was some intervention and some thing that happened that caused people to come together and have relative peace. And I have just casually noticed remarkably little tension among friends of mine from those parts of the world when they talk about each other. And I keep on expecting them to be more tense about it, but they seem to be okay with it. And so I think that comes back to Keena's point about elites. In terms of whether these repairs to democracy can be helpful, I would say there's two kinds of ideas that come to mind, both from Simon's slides, which I got to study for today, and also from Keena's. And I would call those two ideas fire breaks and federalism. And so we think about fire breaks, this spatial heterogeneity of the way that people polarize leads to this sort of nationalization of politics, where these national great forces of, say, non-college whites and college-educated people or whatever it might be, there are these great forces that, played out at a national level, seem to work against discussion and seem to work against amicable resolution of conflicts. But one can imagine that that people who are interested in preserving the kinds of liberties and systems that they have are used to having these be enforced at a national level. But maybe one answer is to have these things, to find our inner federalist and to think, well, maybe the way to preserve what we have is to take more advantage of local mechanisms to do that. And so, sort of building fire breaks between states. As to whether these repairs can work, I would say that we're actually in the middle of doing an experiment of finding out whether the existing repairs could work. They haven't gotten very far, but I will say that that in fact, one of my favorite topics to study over the last few years has been gerrymandering, and at a federal level, the playing field is far more level than it was a decade ago. We are now under a condition where whoever casts more votes is likely to have more seats, and that's indicated by the fact that the average district vote margin this year is about 1% favoring Republicans, and the median seat is 1.4% favoring Republicans, and that's a net advantage of no more than 1 or 2 seats away from a perfectly majoritarian House of Representatives. So the closeness of the House of Representatives right now is in fact a reflection of reforms that people have worked very hard on over the last decade. Of the seats that were decided or will be decided that are within a margin of 7 points or less, 7 of those races are decided in a reform primary known as top 2, where the reform is basically people who do not have to look over their shoulders at being primaried. And so that's 7 seats, and that 7 seats is guaranteed to be more than the margin of the majority in the House of Representatives. And so there is a faction of people in the House who do not have to worry about being primaried by their members of their own party. So, is this enough? I don't know. I think we're about to get a real life experiment, and I generally don't advise that the patient inject themselves while they're ill, but maybe we're going to get some answer to that. And I would say that preparing for the future is a matter of looking ahead now, where like our hot, I forget, Danny Kahneman referred to these as system 1, system 2. Our hot emotions are currently worried about, whether it be Pete Hegseth or Kristi Noem or Matt Getz. Our hot emotions are there, but there is also a matter of containing damage and maintaining norms and maintaining the good things in the American system now. And then there's building towards 2026. And it was a little swing of 6 points that got us to this. And, there's likely to be some kind of swing 2 years from now. And so part of it is what can we keep in the next 2 years and what's going to go away?
So let me just say a few closing comments, if I could. When we started this Global Existential Challenges seminar series a couple of years ago, part of the concern was to think about these big, difficult questions that generate so much uncertainty and also so much anxiety, and the difficulty of responding to them. And obviously today is precisely one of those conversations, both at a theoretical level. A lot of the discussion was pitched at a theoretical level, but also in a very empirical, normative sense, a great deal of fear and uncertainty about what's coming down the pipeline, not only in the United States, but its consequences on a global stage. So first off, I want to thank our panelists for speaking, Simon in absentia, but Sam and Keena for really helping us to think about these conversations at large. And before we clap for them, I want to note that for those of you who don't know all of the references that were in their slides, one of the things that's beautiful about their collaboration is that they've also collaborated with many other people, including people across the university. So there was a reference to Elke Weber, and there was a reference to Naomi Leonard, and there was a reference to Helen Milner, and to Nolan McCarty, and to Anne-Marie Slaughter. These are all people who are part of our community. And so if you're interested, I just encourage you, first off, to go out and also engage their work going forward. Precisely, that's what Pierce is trying to do, is to create these collaborative, multidisciplinary spaces where an engineer, a political scientist, a neuroscientist, an evolutionary biologist can think about these deep questions, but also get us to think about other things going forward. So let me just say that the final seminar of this series will not be on a Thursday. That will be a norm violation rather than a Thursday. At noon, it will be on Monday, and that's going to be with Steve Levitsky, who is known for many things, including the work with Dan Splat on how democracies die. But he's actually going to talk about democratic resilience. So that's going to be an interesting debate. And Nancy Bermeo, who's in the room with us, will serve as our discussant. So I want to thank each and every one of you for coming out today. I think this last week has been one of, as I said, uncertainty, for some celebration, for others mourning. And so to be able to come together and have this sort of conversation is something we all really value. So let's just thank them for their comments.